My name is Jean Tiberio, and I'm a nutritionist and a wellness coach. Welcome to Healing Outside the Box. Today is episode 148, and I'm calling it An Unexpected Consequence of Climate Change on Our Food Supply. Now, I came across this mind-blowing article from Politico, so I put the brakes on the other thing I was doing to talk to you folks about it. But before I get to a consequence of climate change, I have to tell you a story about a consequence of growing organically. And that is, wait for it, squirrels. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with squirrels, which I imagine most people do. After all, they're very cute when they're chasing each other up and down the trees or water skiing. By the way, if you haven't seen the video of the water skiing squirrel, you should go to YouTube and search water skiing squirrel. It might be worth 5 minutes of your life that you won't get back. But anyway, I imagine it's common knowledge that they tend to be a pest. For example, pretty much every year, and you would think by now I would know not to do this, but every year I plant dahlia bulbs. And every year the squirrels eat them. Every year I lovingly look forward to the time when my tulips bud each spring, and every year the squirrels chop them off at the exact same height of the stem, just as they're starting to bloom. But the next pesty thing they did, I did not see coming. It all started about 4 years ago when I gave my parents an organic peach tree. And it was a little teeny tiny tree because, as I recall, I could put it in my van very easily. But this spring, the tree produced 72 tiny little peaches. I know this for a fact because my father counted each and every one of them. I don't know for a fact that maybe he didn't lose count, and that may be an alternative fact, but it was close to 72 tiny little peaches. Then my mother frantically called me one day, back in July, to tell me that the peaches on their peach tree were disappearing. They looked on the ground, no peaches. They counted again, and every day there seemed to be fewer peaches. The evidence was mounting that there was a four-legged suspect stealing the peaches. But who? Then one morning, my father looked out and saw a squirrel sitting on a branch on his hind feet with his two little front paws holding that tiny peach. I didn't see it myself, but I dare say that squirrel was munching heartily, with little remorse for whose peaches he was eating. It saddens me to think of it now, but this is one of the unintended consequences of organic farming. We ended up with only 12 peaches after planting, grooming, hoping, envisioning all of that delicious fruit. And that is basically what this article in Politico is all about. And that is that global warming has consequences that may still surprise us, even with everything that we now know about it. Of course, we know that CO2 levels in the atmosphere are rising, and that this is resulting in many changes in our ability to sustain an adequate food supply for over 7 billion people, mostly because of droughts. But this article suggests that CO2 directly affects the nutritional quality of edible plants. This is the first time I've ever seen this even suggested. We apparently now have about twice the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere as we did back when Americans started farming with equipment like tractors. Not that long ago, if you think about the length of time that people have been farming, which is almost 10,000 years. We learned back in junior high that CO2 is taken up by plants. So shouldn't more CO2 be great for plants? Well, one Republican from Texas was just all over this, I guess like a wet blanket. He argued that lots of CO2 would be great for us because it's great for plants. Now, setting aside the obvious, which is that he had forgotten people actually breathe oxygen, there's a possibility that Republicans are even wrong about that. This article reports that scientists now believe higher CO2 levels cause plants to make more glucose and less nutrients. and the nutrients they're speaking about are protein, vitamins, and many minerals. This guy named Lolatz, I think I'm pronouncing that right. Well, probably not. It's Loladze if you'd like to look him up. He's arguing that rising CO2 and human nutrition are inversely linked. He published an article about it back in 2002, about 15 years ago. He noticed that there was only one research article looking at rising CO2 levels and the effects on nutrients in rice. And we all know that poor people around the globe look to rice for much of their nutrient and caloric needs. The article showed a drop in zinc and iron that started appearing about 2 decades ago. It appears that there were no follow-up articles. And folks, there are research studies on every darn thing imaginable. How did this slip through the cracks? So theoretically, what is changing in plants due to rising CO2 levels is the ratio of carbohydrate, complex and simple sugars, to nutrients. More sugar, less nutrients. Now presently, in 2017, this is considered a minor shift in the carbohydrate to nutrient ratio. But as I like to say, what we don't know about this issue is a lot. In particular, we don't know the rate at which this problem is growing. Some might say, if we can chemically add back vitamins and minerals, as we do in fortified breads and cereals, and we can genetically modify food, should we care about this? I certainly don't know, but luckily for us, there are scientists who are now sitting up and paying attention. It has recently been shown that elevated CO2 levels result in lower mineral levels of calcium, potassium, zinc, and iron, about an 8% reduction on average. Ditto for proteins, it appears. Researchers found that there was a 6% drop in the protein of wheat and an 8% drop in the protein of rice over the past 40 or 50 years. Now again, this is going to be a particular problem for people in developing countries like India or say Bangladesh, who rely on rice for much of their protein needs. Not to mention the fact that I hear nearly 1/4 of southern Bangladesh is now underwater due to climate change. And also, lower zinc and protein levels put pregnant mothers and infants most in jeopardy, again in these developing countries. There's also the problem of anemia, because people in countries like Bangladesh probably don't have cocoa pebbles that are fortified with iron. Here in the US, the problem might not be the decrease in nutrients, but the increase in sugars in these edible plants. And I don't suppose anyone has to tell anyone that obesity and diabetes are an ever-expanding problem in this country. This guy from the USDA, named Louis Ziska, is looking at a weed called goldenrod that is certainly a nuisance for allergy sufferers, but not so much for honeybees, who feast on this goldenrod and use it for their protein needs to get through the winter months. And we need to care about the honeybees because those little honeybees pollinate what we care about. It was, I imagine, exciting for this guy to study goldenrod, and I found it exciting that he found it exciting because it has been growing wild and ignored by GMO chemists as it's not an edible plant. They found that the protein content in goldenrod has decreased by 1/3 since the Industrial Revolution. That may be a snooze for us, but it's very important for those little honeybees who have been hit by aerial spraying of pesticides and so many other things. And if those poor little honeybees die out, then they can't pollinate what we eat. It's that simple. Ziska's work suggests that the decline in the protein of the goldenrod that they feed off might contribute to the decline in the honeybee population. This guy Ziska is also saying that we might not have yet discovered how many different ways that rising CO2 levels can affect edible plants. In other words, we don't know what we don't know. The scientists are making another point which I found interesting. Because it's our planet collectively, we all need to work together on this. In other words, climate scientists have to work with botanists, who have to work with honeybee people, who probably should work with nutritionists, who have to work with public health officials. And we all have to come together to put pressure on politicians, some of whom hear the words global warming and the words send a shiver up their spine. There's this guy named Samuel Myers, who's a climate researcher at Harvard, and he says, quote, "This is the tip of the iceberg. It's been hard for us to get people to understand how many questions they should have," end quote. Myers published an article in the journal Nature that also confirmed a significant drop in proteins. He looked at many plants in the US, Japan, and Australia. He found significant drops in iron and zinc as well. He notes that this is a tiny piece of a much larger picture about how rising CO2 levels affect ecosystems around the world. Which brings me back to those darn squirrels eating my parents' peaches. As much as my evil twin wanted to spray their fat little faces with DDT, the answer cannot be more pesticides or more coal burning or more genetically modified foods. Obviously, those are the actions that got us into this mess in the first place. Understanding the larger picture is what all of these brilliant scientists are now starting to do. And I, for one, am glad that these people are opening our eyes to see our way out of this, even if that means tolerating honeybees and, well, yes, squirrels. That's all I have for you today. Be well and stay tuned next week for another episode of Healing Outside the Box.